So I'd like to welcome everyone back to, well, I'd like to say Langri Tumpa, but of course everyone's at home, but to this program. Again, we're continuing on from the last program, the Shamatha practice, and this time we'll be observing the mind as the object for Shamatha practice. In the earlier program, we were using the mindfulness of breathing as the object for this Shamatha practice. So let's have a look at what we'll be covering in this session this evening. So this program is going to be over 6 sessions, each one 90 minutes as per last program, from 7 till 8:30. And this time it's on a Monday and a Friday. So for the next 3 Mondays and Fridays, we'll be running this program. The structure of each session will be the same as in the last program. That is, we'll begin with a meditation, then there'll be a presentation of that topic, another meditation, and then time for question answer at the end of the session. So as Miffy mentioned, then for the question answer, then anytime during the session, just if you have a question, just put it in the chat, and then Miffy will read out those questions at the end of the session. We're going to be really covering sort of 3 related practices in this program. As we see here for this week, observe the 2 sessions are called Observing Thoughts, Observing Emotions. So that will be this practice of observing our thoughts. Observing emotions is a variation of that. Then next week, we'll be doing this resting in awareness practice. The nature of mind is a variation of that. And then in the 3rd week, a practice called stillness in motion, which is really combining these 2 practices of observing thoughts and resting in awareness. And then the open awareness practice is how we would bring that into daily life. And as similar to the last program, the recommended reading for this program is the same book, The Attention Revolution from Alan Wallace. And the materials, I'll be using a little bit. I won't be going through these materials in a lot of detail because we did that already in the previous program, but I'll be touching on a few of the things from this color chart and a couple of things from this 9 stages to Shamatha chart in the coming sessions. Not so much this evening, but in the coming sessions, I'll touch on those a little bit. So if you have them handy, that's helpful. Otherwise, they'll be up on the slides anyway. So let's have a look at what we'll be covering in this evening's session titled Observing Thoughts. We'll begin with a meditation, settling body, speech, and mind. So really just sort of preparing body and mind for this session, and also setting a motivation for this session and setting the motivation for this program as well. Following that, we'll begin with an overview of Shamatha practice, what it is, and some of the main points of Shamatha. All of these points we covered in the previous program, but just to review them here before we launch into observing thoughts, what do we mean by that? Then we'll look at the actual practice of observing thoughts. We'll do a guided meditation on that. A few tips for the practice after the meditation. Time for question answer, and then we'll finish with a dedication. So we'll begin with a meditation, and same as last session, last program, we'll do 15-minute practice, and I'll switch off my video so as to distract you. So we'll just do a 15-minute practice now to really help settle body, speech, and mind, and also to set a good motivation. So finding a nice, comfortable posture. As an act of loving kindness for yourself, allow your awareness to descend into the body, right down to the ground, becoming aware of the sensations where your body is touching the cushion or the chair. And then allow your awareness to rise up and fill the entire space of the body. And simply become aware of sensations throughout the body. And if you notice any areas of tightness or tension in any part of the body, then use the out breath to relax and release that tightness or tension. And bringing your awareness to the area of your face, and softening and relaxing all the muscles in the face. The mouth and jaw, soft and relaxed. And all the muscles around the eyes, soft and relaxed. In this way, allowing the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. And then we can take 3 slow, deep breaths, maintaining awareness of sensations throughout the body as you breathe. And then allow your breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. Not trying to control or regulate the breath in any way. Simply allowing it to flow naturally and effortlessly. And then give yourself permission to let go of any hopes or fears, worries or concerns about the past or the future. To give yourself permission to let go of all of these things for the duration of this short meditation. And simply allow the mind to come to rest in the present moment. Not doing anything at all, simply being present. resting in the present moment. Relaxed, still, and clear. And to help anchor yourself in the present moment, start to become aware of the rhythm of your breath, noticing if it's long or short, deep or shallow, slow or fast, without trying to modify it in any way. So simply becoming aware of the rhythm of your breath. And then think about your motivation for attending this program. And then set the best possible motivation you can for attending this evening's session and for attending this program. And try to include others in your motivation as well. That you're not just doing this for your own benefit. And if you're following the Mahayana path, then the highest motivation is the motivation of bodhicitta, the aspiration for full awakening for the benefit of others. And then keeping this motivation in mind, we can slowly finish this meditation and begin our discussions here together this evening. So let's begin with an overview of some of the main points of shamatha practice. And these were all covered in the last program, but here's a condensed summary of the main points. So what is shamatha? Shamatha is a Sanskrit term. The first part of the word shama means calm, a mind that's not discursive, and ta means to remain or abide. So shamatha is often translated as calm abiding. A mind that's not only calm, but it's abiding, i.e. focusing single-pointedly on an object. So shamatha is the practice of cultivating a calm, clear, and focused mind. In other words, it's a concentration practice, or in Sanskrit, samadhi practice. In the Theravada Buddhist traditions, they often use a different term for concentration practice. You often hear them referred to jhana practice. It's the same practice, just a different level of concentration. And why is this shamatha practice so important? We saw there that in terms of everyday life, shamatha practice will help to improve our attention skills. And through improving our attention skills, we'll become much more effective in everything we do in our life. We'll have much better mental balance, meaning much less agitation and stress and so forth. And instead of being the slaves of our own mind, we will become the masters of our own mind. And we'll talk more about this in this program that's directly relevant to this variation of the shamatha practice. And also we often find that shamatha practice brings health benefits in terms of physical health benefits and often in terms of improved sleep as well. But here in the Buddhist context, at a deeper level, the shamatha practice is important because it's an integral part of the pursuit of genuine happiness. That in the pursuit of genuine happiness and inner well-being, there are three main areas of practice in all Buddhist traditions of ethics, concentration, and wisdom. And so the shamatha practice, the concentration practice, is really the basis of the wisdom or vipassana practice. And so here we have a quote from Attention Revolution, the recommended reading, which says, mental balance is the gateway to finding genuine happiness, and shamatha is the key that opens that gate. So if we really want to find that genuine happiness, inner well-being, then we really need to engage in this shamatha practice because it's a key to it. It's really the foundation, the basis of finding that genuine happiness, the basis of vipassana practice. In terms of the shamatha meditation, we can talk about preparation and then the actual practice. In terms of preparation, which is in common with all meditation practices, is to prepare body, speech, and mind. And we saw there that preparing the body is to set up a good posture, meaning to have a back straight, or in other words, a vigilant posture, to have the body completely relaxed, and then allowing the body to remain as still as possible. So basically setting a good posture and then forgetting about the body so that it doesn't create any interference in the meditation. And then preparing speech was to simply allow the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. And by allowing that, that can settle down these inner speech, inner chit-chat. So that's a segue into preparing the mind. And then preparing the mind, again, allow the mind to come into relaxation, into the present moment, into that stillness of the present moment, and remaining clear. So in terms of preparation, these are the main points in preparing for shamatha practice, meditation, but also all meditation practice. And in terms of the actual meditation, shamatha meditation, we looked at 4 topics. First, what qualities do we cultivate in this practice? What object should we focus on? What tools do we use? And what sort of faults can come up and how do we overcome them? So let's have a look at each one of those 4 points in a little bit of detail. The first is, what qualities are we cultivating in this practice? And here we have a quote from Panchen Losang Chökyi Gyaltsen, a great Tibetan master from the 16th century. So in the Shamatha part of his Mahamudra text, he says, the concentration to be accomplished here is a concentration possessing 2 aspects, vivid clarity and a non-discursive single-pointedness. So generally, historically, in the meditation texts on Shamatha, they point to these 2 qualities: stability, a non-discursive single-pointedness, meaning a stable mind that is not getting distracted from the object, but also a clear mind, a mind of clarity, be able to focus on the object very clearly. So these generally are the 2 qualities that are mentioned in the meditation texts. But here we added that 3rd quality that normally you won't really see so much about in the meditation text, and that's the quality of relaxation. That's something very important for us in the modern world, because many of us, due to the type of lifestyle we lead, have a lot of agitation, stress, chaotic mind, and we bring a lot of tension into practice. And then we try to focus with that tension, and we have all sorts of difficulties. So the very first thing we really need to do in this and any meditation practice is establish a basis in relaxation to overcome that tension. And here we have a quote again from Attention Revolution, in that each of these 3 qualities is the basis of the next quality. So here Alan Wallace says, the relationship among these 3 qualities can be likened to the roots, trunk, and foliage of a tree. As your practice grows, the roots of relaxation go deeper, the trunk of stability gets stronger, and the foliage of vividness reaches higher. So I can't overemphasize this point enough, this establishing a basis in relaxation. If we don't have a relaxed body and mind, there is no way we're going to be able to cultivate any sort of sustainable stability and clarity of attention. It will be like a tree, a big tree without a root system. A bit of wind will come, it'll just fall over. Our practice will fall over. So therefore, first we need to sink these deep roots of relaxation that can support a strong trunk of stability. The stronger the trunk of stability, the higher the branches and leaves of clarity can go. So we are to emphasize cultivating these qualities in this order in this shamatha practice. So those are the qualities. What object to use? The general recommendation is to use the object that works best for you. And in many Buddhist traditions, the one that's recommended a lot is the breath. And here we have a quote from a great Indian Buddhist master, Sangha from the 4th century, who says, if involuntary thoughts particularly dominate your behavior, then focus the mind in mindfulness of the exhalation and inhalation of the breath. So I think this accounts for about 95% of the modern day population. We have a lot of obsessive compulsive thinking going on all the time. And so therefore, the breath for many of us will be the best object to use, at least initially in the shamatha practice, because it really helps us to get out of that obsessive compulsive thinking mind and get out of the past and future into the present moment. And so that's why we use the breath in the earlier program that we did, the first program on the shamatha practice, mindfulness of breathing. And there we looked at a number of variations of mindfulness of breathing, the full body breath practice, which was very good for cultivating relaxation, focusing in the area of the abdomen, very good for improving stability of attention, and then focusing at the entrance of the nostrils, very good for improving clarity of attention. And in this program, we're going to be focusing on 2 other objects that particularly Alan Wallace is recommending. And the first of those is the mind, in other words, to observe our thoughts. And that's what we're going to focus on in this and the session on Friday. Then we have awareness, which is just resting in awareness itself. And that's what we're going to focus on in the 2 sessions next week. In the Shamatha texts, a number of other objects are mentioned. Often in Tibetan Buddhism, one object that's recommended is using a mental image of a Buddha. But any of you who've tried that, many of people find that quite difficult because it's a complex visualization, and often we're not very good at visualizing, and we're not really so familiar with what a Buddha looks like. And even sometimes in the text, meditation text on shamatha, it says, oh, you even find focusing on the breath difficult. Okay, start with a visual object such as a stick or a pebble, put it in front of you and look at it. So you could possibly use a sense object, a visual object, or even a sound, for example, a repetitive sound, as a way to get into the shamatha practice, but these are very coarse objects and we won't be able to get very far in them. We'll have to move to a more subtle object, such as the breath or observing the mind. Now, the recommendation from Alan Wallace here, we see on page 6 of his Attention Revolution, he says the following. He says, to guide meditators along these 10 stages, I have chosen from Buddhist teachings, and 10 stages were those 9 stages in that chart plus shamatha result. I have chosen from Buddhist teachings 3 techniques that I found effective for people in the modern world. These 3 techniques are the basis for the 3 divisions of this book. For the first 4 stages, you should practice whatever method you find easiest. By stage 5, the mind is relatively stable and you can move on to subtler techniques. For achieving the first 4 stages, I recommend the practice of mindfulness of breathing, variations of which can be found in Zen, Vipassana, and Tibetan Buddhism. Mindfulness of breathing means settling your awareness on the sensations involved in breathing, continually returning your attention there whenever your mind wanders. Beginning with the 5th stage, I recommend a method called settling the mind in its natural state. So that's the name he gives to the practice that we're going to do in this and on the session on Friday. In other words, observing thoughts. And he says, in this technique, you direct your attention to mental experiences. That is, all the events such as thoughts, mental images, and emotions that arise in the domain of the mind. This method is drawn from the Dzogchen lineage, but is found in other Buddhist traditions as well. With the instructions for the 8th attentional stage onward, we move on to the still subtler practice of maintaining awareness of awareness itself. So that's the practice we're going to be doing next week, the resting in awareness practice. Here, the practice is not so much one of developing attentional stability and clarity as it is of discovering the stillness and luminosity inherent in awareness itself. The training, he goes on to say, the training in mindfulness of breathing may be helpful to anyone, including those seeking to prevent or treat attention deficit hyperactivity disorders. Many people find the second practice, that of settling the mind in its natural state, to be more challenging, but some meditators take to it naturally. Likewise, the practice of awareness is subtler still, but it may be optimal from the beginning for those who are strongly drawn to it. He says, you may use any one of the 3 methods to progress along all 10 stages of attentional development, or you may follow the sequence described in this book. How fast you progress will depend on the level of your commitment and the degree to which your lifestyle and environment support such practice. So what he's recommending is really, there's 2 sort of recommendations there. One is he's saying all of these 3 practices, the breath, mind, and resting in awareness, are particularly suited for us in the modern world, as we're going to see more in this program, and to pick one of those as your method. Alternatively, start with the breath because it's most easy until you move up along those stages towards shamatha. Then you can move to observing the mind in the middling stages, and then in the high stages is just go into that resting in awareness practice. So that's sort of the other recommendation that he's giving. So you can use the breath all the way to shamatha, the mind all the way to shamatha, or resting in awareness all the way to shamatha. Use the object that works best for you. Tools. What tools do we use? So here we have a quote again from that famous Buddhist master from the 6th century, Bhavaviveka, he says, and we see the analogy here of the elephant of the mind in the chart. He says, the out of control elephant of the mind is to be bound to the firm post of the observed object using the rope of mindfulness and gradually brought under control by the hook of introspection. So we see here there are two main tools in the shamatha practice. And we see in the analogy here, we see the elephant running wildly ahead of the meditator, the elephant of the mind. And the meditator there, in his left hand is a rope, that's the rope of mindfulness, in the right hand, the hook of introspection. So these are the two main tools we use in this practice. And mindfulness is a translation of the original Sanskrit term smrti or the Pali term sati. And both of these terms literally mean memory, to remember. So it's basically, mindfulness is our ability to remember the object, to hold the object, to not forget the object, to not become distracted. And this is often defined then as the faculty of sustaining voluntary attention continuously upon a familiar object without forgetfulness or distraction. And what we need to remember is that in a lot of modern day mindfulness traditions, they've redefined what the word mindfulness means. And in a lot of modern day traditions, mindfulness is often defined as something like a non-judgmental awareness of whatever is arising in the present moment. Very good thing to do, but this is not really how the word mindfulness was originally defined. So we need to be aware of that difference of usage of the word mindfulness. So here, mindfulness is simply our ability to hold the object, to remember the object, to not get distracted from the object. Together with that, we need some quality control. That's introspection. And here it's defined as the mental faculty having the function of monitoring the state of one's body and mind. And particularly in the practice of shamatha, the principal function of is to note the occurrence of laxity and excitation. So it's just really quality control. How's mindfulness going? Are we still holding the object, or are we starting to become dull or distracted? So these are the two main tools we use in shamatha practice. And of the two, mindfulness is principal. And the more we cultivate and strengthen mindfulness, the more our ability to introspect, to do quality control, improves as a byproduct. And in terms of faults, what sorts of faults can come up in this practice, and what are the antidotes? Again, we have a quote here from Panchen Losang Chökyi Gyaltsen, the shamatha part of his Mahamudra text. He says, shamatha is attained by progressing through the 9 stages, relying on the 8 antidotes to abandon the 5 faults. So here, the first fault is laziness. And laziness has actually 4 antidotes, as we saw in the last program. Like everything in our life, if we see no benefit in some activity, then we're going to be very lazy when it comes to doing that activity. Similarly here, if we really don't appreciate the benefits of this practice, we're going to be very lazy when it comes to meditating, doing shamatha practice. So therefore, to cultivate faith, we reflect on the benefits of the practice and see how this practice will bring us enormous benefits, both in terms of improving attention skills for everyday life, but also as a gateway to genuine happiness and inner well-being. And then we'll develop faith. We'll have a lot of faith that this practice will really benefit us a lot. And the more faith then we have in the practice, then the more we'll develop the second antidote of aspiration, the more we'll want to do the practice. And then the more aspiration we have to do the practice, then the more effort and enthusiasm we'll actually put into the practice. And then the more effort and enthusiasm we put into the practice, the more we'll have the fourth antidote, this pliancy, this flexibility, serviceability of body and mind. Now our body and mind are not very pliant or flexible. We have a lot of heaviness in the body. We have a lot of resistance in the mind to the practice. But the more we engage in the practice, the more flexible and pliant our body and mind becomes. Our body will feel much more light, and we'll have much less resistance in the mind to the practice, much more joy in the practice. And here we have a quote from Lama Tsongkhapa, the founder of the Geluk school of Tibetan Buddhism in the 14th century. And he says, if you cannot stop the laziness of being disinclined to cultivate concentration and of enjoying things that are not conducive to it, from the outset, you will not gain entry into concentration. So this is the first step, that we need to overcome this laziness to really get into the shamatha practice. And then once we get into the shamatha practice, then the next fault is forgetfulness. Forgetfulness here can be forgetting the instructions and forgetting the object. And so the antidote there is mindfulness, to remember the instructions, to remember the object. And then the third fault is this twin pair of laxity and excitation, which are the technical terms for dullness and distraction. So the antidote to that is introspection, is quality control, is to notice when our mind is either becoming dull or distracted, and then fixing it accordingly. And we'll look at that a little bit more in the next slide. But first, the fourth fault of non-application. Non-application is where we've noticed we've become dull or distracted and we don't do anything about that. That's a problem. So the antidote is application, means fix it, do something. Generally, that will mean simply reapplying mindfulness to the object. And then the last fault, over-application, is something that as a beginner is not really a big issue, but can become a fault or problem once we get into the higher levels of the practice. And over-application is where we're putting unnecessary effort to adjust the mind when we don't need to. So the antidote to that is equanimity, means balance, that the mind is already balanced, leave it as it is. Don't unnecessarily adjust the focus when we don't need to. So let's have a look at these two imbalances of laxity and excitation. And excitation is the most common form of distraction. Most common form of distraction is we get pulled away by the so-called sense pleasures. And we see that in the shamatha diagram here, the 5 sense objects that are most common form of distraction. So we see down the bottom there, toward the left there, we have the fruit, so that's taste. Beside that, we have that silk cloth, which is tactile. Above that, the 2 round objects are symbols, so that's sound. To the left of that is the conch shell with some perfume in it, so that's smell. And then diagonally above it, we have the mirror, which is symbolizing visual objects. So these are the 5 sense objects, and so these are the most common forms of distraction. We're pulled away by the sensory pleasures, so therefore excitation. What to do in the event of excitation or distraction? So we introduced in the last program these 3 key terms that can be very helpful. Because often when we get distracted, our first impulse is to get frustrated that we got distracted, get upset with ourselves, and then we tense even more. So therefore, to counteract that natural tendency is whenever we notice we're getting distracted, first thing to do is simply relax the body and mind. And then release the distraction, let go of the distraction, and very gently return to the object without clamping down more forcefully. So every time we get distracted, simply relax, release, and return. Keep coming back to the object again and again, patiently and happily. And then laxity is the technical term for dullness. So if we notice that our mind is sinking, is getting dull, then one of the main reasons that it tends to get dull is we've simply lost interest in the practice. And so therefore, the first thing to do is to refresh our interest in the practice, to uplift the mind. Maybe even if we need to very briefly reflect on the benefits of the practice. And then restore our attention on the object, to hold the object again with mindfulness, and then to retain that ongoing flow of mindfulness of the object. So refresh, restore, and retain. And we'll be using these key terms also here in this shamatha practice, observing the mind, which we're about to introduce very shortly. In fact, we introduce them right now. So that was a brief overview of the shamatha practice. So we looked at the qualities of relaxation, stability, clarity, the objects, the three objects that Alan Wallace particularly recommends for us in the modern world, the breath, the mind, and resting in awareness. And we'll be looking at the awareness practice next week. And then the tools, the rope of mindfulness, the hook of introspection, and then the 5 faults and 8 antidotes. And by applying those 8 antidotes to 5 faults, we can slowly move along those 9 stages towards the goal of shamatha. So now here to introduce the practice that we're going to be doing today and on Friday is a quote from a great 19th century Dzogchen master, Dudjung Lingpa. So what we find is that in the Kagyu and Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism, where the main practices are Mahamudra and Dzogchen, both of these are what's called nature of mind practices. So when it comes to realizing nature of reality, they're focusing on the mind. So they're called nature of mind practices. And so therefore, as a basis for those Vipassana practices to come to realize nature of mind, they emphasize in the shamatha to use the mind as the object for shamatha practice. And so here we have from Dudjung Lingpa, a great Dzogchen master from 19th century, Tibetan Dzogchen master. He says the following. He says, "Some cannot calm their thoughts because the mind is so agitated. Such people should relax and let thoughts be as they are, continually observing them with mindfulness and introspection." So a couple of points on that. First off, this word thought. Often when we see this word thought in Buddhism, particularly in Tibetan Buddhist texts, it's a translation of the original Sanskrit term vikalpa, or the Tibetan term namdok. And both of those terms simply means conceptual activity. So here, when we talk about observing thoughts, we're not just talking about thinking, we're talking about all conceptual activity. So it's including not only thinking, but also emotions, memories, and mental images. So all of these are thoughts. So observing thoughts means to observe all mental conceptual activity. Now, in the mindfulness of breathing practice we did in the last program, we had to let go of thoughts. If a thought came up, we had to let go and come back to the breath. So thoughts were distractions. Here, as Dudjung Lingpa says, let thoughts be. Let thoughts be means that thoughts are not distractions. Thoughts are part of the object. So let thoughts be, we are to simply, as Dudjung Lingpa says, continually observe them with mindfulness and introspection. In other words, not following thoughts, not trying to modify or get rid of thoughts. This practice is not about trying to make the mind still. If you've ever tried to make your mind still, you know it doesn't work. It just agitates the mind more. In this practice, we're not trying to make the mind still. In fact, in some respects, it's often better to have thoughts than have no thoughts in this practice, because the great danger in this practice, when there are no thoughts coming up, we can easily drift off into a sort of a dull, spaced out state of mind. And that's not shamatha practice. Whereas if there's thoughts continually arising, it challenges us to look at them, to observe them, to stay focused. What are some of the advantages of this practice? Remember, the goal of this practice, like mindfulness of breathing, is shamatha, to cultivate a calm, clear, focused mind. So that's the goal of this practice, observing the mind, observing thoughts. But some of the side benefits of this, using this object of shamatha practice, is that this can really help us to become masters of our own mind, instead of being the slaves of our own mind. Many of us in the modern world are often tormented and overwhelmed by our thoughts, emotions, and memories. And then often we don't know how to deal with them. And so what we do is we try to suppress them. And trying to suppress them just creates even more problems. So we're fighting with our mind. We either get caught up or we try and fight with it, and creates even more problems. But what we can understand, particularly by doing this practice, is that we can really start to see that thoughts, emotions, and memories from their own side have no power to harm us. Because if we look at what a thought, emotion, or memory is from its own side, it's virtually nothing. They have no power in themselves to harm us. They only have power to harm us if we give them power, either by identifying with them and following them or trying to suppress them. Then they have a lot of power to harm us. In this practice, we are simply stepping back and watching them. So then we won't be giving them power. And so we will become the masters of our own mind. That every time we follow a thought or try and suppress it, we feed the habit of it coming up again and again and again and again. If we step back and simply watch them, then we're not feeding them, which means the habit of all this blah, blah, blah stuff coming up will get weaker and weaker and weaker. And over time, you'll find your mind becomes more naturally quiet and still. And this is a topic we'll be looking at in more detail in Friday's session. And also, if we develop this ability to be able to observe our thoughts and emotions and memories, then later, if some very strong mental event, some strong thought, emotion, and memory would come up, we could simply be fully present with it without it overwhelming us. And again, that's something we'll look at in a little bit more detail in Friday's session. And so this practice also is very much known as a healing practice, because I think a lot of mental health issues, a lot of actually even physical problems is through suppressing thoughts, emotions, and memories. And so in this practice, we're not suppressing, and simply by allowing them to come up and acknowledging them, that we can start to release them. And that can really start the healing process of healing our mind. And also this practice by observing the mind is very much a bridge into Vipassana practice, that simply by observing our mind, observing our thoughts and emotions, we can even come to an intuitive insight into the nature of our mind, which is Vipassana practice. So this is very much a bridge into Vipassana practice. So let's have a look at some of the quintessential instructions for this practice before we go to the meditation. The first instruction here we see is let your gaze be vacant. So we saw in the last program that with the eyes, in terms of the body posture, what to do with the eyes, the general recommendation for meditation was to have them eyes slightly open, because if we have them closed, then it's easy to drift into dullness. And if we have them too open, then maybe some agitation. But we saw there that in that earlier program, that for many of us who tend to be quite agitated in the modern world, as a beginner, even having them slightly open, observing, say, the breath, may find a little bit too much agitation. So you may find, if you're a highly agitated sort of person, beginning meditation practice, particularly on the breath, to have the eyes lightly closed may be helpful to reduce that agitation. But as we get into the practice, at some point you will find that probably having them closed will start to create problems with falling into dullness or laxity. Now here in this practice, it's very much recommended to have the eyes open. So let your gaze be vacant. Have your eyes either partially or naturally open, and just simply resting your gaze in the space in front of you. So you're not really looking at anything. Now, there are a number of advantages for having the eyes open. So we see that at the bottom of the slide here. The first is, as we saw earlier, is by having the eyes open, letting some light in, that can help avoid falling into laxity or dullness. Also, though, even though we're not really looking at anything, it can really help ground us better in the present moment. With the eyes closed, particularly observing the mind, it's much easier to go off into the past and the future. With the eyes open, helps to really lock us a little bit better into the present moment. Even though we're not really looking at it, our eyes are a little bit engaged, and of course visual only happens in the present moment. So it's really anchors us a little bit better in the present moment. And also, having the eyes open helps break down this false sense of duality. With the eyes closed, we really have a strong sense that there's a me in here and a world out there. There's subject-object duality. And that's what we're trying to come to realize, that there is no subject-object duality in Vipassana practice. So here in this Shamatha practice, if we're doing this practice with eyes open, then there's not such a strong sense of inner and outer. And so already we're starting to break down this false sense of duality. So that's going to be very helpful later when we move into Vipassana practice, to come to actually realize there is no subject-object duality. And particularly in this practice also, to break down this false idea that our mind is some little thing inside of our head. Because with the eyes closed, we can have this strong sense the mind is a little thing somewhere inside our head. But also this, having the eyes open, this practice helps to facilitate transitioning into daily life. Because also in daily life, we want to be able to observe our thoughts, emotions, memories without getting caught up in them. But if we've only ever learnt to do that in meditation with eyes closed, it's hard to bring that into daily life, because generally in daily life, we have our eyes open. So therefore, if we meditate with eyes open and develop that ability to observe our thoughts, emotions, and memories with eyes open, then it's much easier to do that in daily life when we also have our eyes open. So these are 4 reasons why to have the eyes open in this practice. And I'll speak a little bit more about some tips for eyes open a little bit later. I think it's coming in Friday's session, actually. And the other quintessential instruction here before we go to the actual practice is without distraction and without grasping. So we're observing thoughts, emotions, memories arise and pass. Without distraction means not allowing ourselves to get caught up in whatever's appearing in our mind and getting swept away. And without grasping means to not identify, particularly with the subjective mental events, particularly the emotions and so forth, not identifying and getting caught up and following those. So without distraction, without grasping, simply observing mental events, thoughts, emotions, memories, mental images, arise and pass, arise and pass. So let's now put all that together into the actual practice that we're going to do now. So observing thoughts. So what is the object here? What are we observing? The object for this practice is the space of the mind and whatever mental events arise in that space. So again, any thoughts, emotions, mental images, memories, and so forth. So we're only focusing on mental events. So in this practice, we're not focusing on sense events. So we're not paying attention to visual objects, sounds, sensations, and so forth. These things will arise, sounds will arise, sensations in the body will arise, but we're not paying attention to them. Let them be there. We're just not interested in them. We're only focusing on the mental events. And preparation, as we've seen earlier, we go through the preparation at the beginning of the meditation, preparing body, speech, and mind, setting a body into the state of relaxation, still, keeping the body still, and a vigilant posture. And then the speech, allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. And with this practice, and also the resting in awareness practice that we'll be doing next week, if you prefer, if you find it better, you prefer, you can breathe through the mouth. For the mindfulness of breathing, particularly focusing at nostrils, then of course we need to breathe through the nose. But here, sometimes people find that when they're observing mind or resting in awareness, there's less resistance when breathing through the mouth. And so you can breathe through the mouth if you prefer. Now, mouth or nose, both equally okay in this practice. And then the mind, again, to allow the mind to become relaxed, still, and clear, and particularly bringing it into the present moment, letting go of any sort of expectations for the practice. Let your gaze be vacant. So again, having the eyes either partially or naturally open, making sure that we're not trying to deliberately unfocus the gaze, that's straining the eyes. So make sure all the muscles around the eyes are soft and relaxed and sort of looking in a slightly downward direction. So partially or naturally open, whichever you prefer. And then observing those mental events arise and pass without distraction, without grasping, meaning not following, not trying to suppress, not trying to modify, just observing whatever's there arise and pass. If we get caught up in any excitation, distraction, as earlier, relax and then release grasping to the thought and return to observing the mind. Falling into laxity or dullness, refresh the interest in the practice if you've lost enthusiasm for the practice. Restore your attention on the object, the mind, and then retain that mindfulness, observing the mind. So that's the practice we're going to do now. So let's do that practice, 15 minutes. So if you'd like to find a nice, comfortable posture, let's begin. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. A vigilant posture is to keep the back nice and straight. And at the same time, allow the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. And relaxing more deeply with each out-breath. Allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. Allowing the breath to flow naturally and effortlessly. And preparing the mind. Simply allowing the mind to come to rest in the present moment. Resting in that stillness of the present moment. Relaxed, still, and clear. And now allow your eyes to be at least partially open. Vacantly resting your gaze in the space in front of you, keeping the eyes soft and relaxed. Blink as often as you need. And now bring your attention to your own mind and observe your own mind and whatever mental events arise in the mind. That is, any thoughts, emotions, memories, mental images, without following thoughts, without trying to get rid of thoughts. Simply be like an impartial observer or witness, observing thoughts and other mental events as they arise and pass, without grasping to them, without becoming distracted. If you're new to this practice and you're not sure where to focus, then every now and again, deliberately generate a thought. Any thought will do. And watch that thought as it arises in your mind, and watch it as it disappears back into the mind. And then keep your attention right where it was and see what comes up next in that space. Now, if you find that you've got caught up in a thought and got carried away, the first thing to do is simply relax. Then release grasping onto that thought and very gently return to observing the mind. So relax, release, and return. Keep coming back to the mind again and again, patiently and happily. We can bring the meditation to a close. Just a couple of tips for the practice before we go for question answer. When we begin this practice, probably the most common experience that we have is that we simply get caught up in our thoughts because that's our habit. I mean, that's our strong habit we've developed, particularly in the modern world. Some thought or some idea or something comes up in our mind, we latch onto it and off we go on our stories. And so therefore, that's our habit. So when we try and do this practice, we sit, we watch, first thought comes, off we go. So therefore, um, if we get caught up in a thought, as per the breath practice, when we get distracted, first thing to do is relax, then release grasping onto that thought, and then return to observing the mind again. So just keep coming back every time you get caught up and swept away. There's a couple of other short-term strategies we can introduce into the practice to help us to be able to better observe thoughts. One of those, which we'll introduce in the next meditation on Friday evening, is what's called noting or labeling thoughts. So when some mental event comes up, to give ourselves some space from it is to give it a name, like thought, memory, image, frustration, and so forth. To give it a name, and that gives us some space from that mental event, particularly not labeling the content, but just the what type of event it was. Was it a thought? Was it a memory, an image, frustration, craving, so forth? So that can help us to not get it swept away. Another thing we're going to introduce also on Friday is another short-term strategy to help avoid getting swept away so much is anchor in the breath. That is, if you're getting swept away a lot, even if you're trying to do labeling and noting, if you're finding you're still getting swept away, then anchor in the breath. So go back and focus on the breath, particularly the rhythm of the breath, but any of the variations of the breath practice that we did in the last one, the nostrils, abdomen, and so forth. Anchor in that. Focus on that as your main object. And then a little bit in the corner of your mind, notice your thoughts arising. And so that anchors, helps avoid getting swept away. And if you're still getting swept away all the time, it can be quite disheartening and think, well, I can't do this practice at all. So then what we can do is what we did at the beginning of this meditation. There's another short-term strategy, and that is to deliberately, every now and again, deliberately generate thoughts. Generally, when a thought is arising, it doesn't say, here I come, be ready. Before we know it, it's there. And before we know it, we're off, we're gone. Whereas if we're generating a thought, we know it's coming, so we're ready for it. So we can watch it arise and dissipate again. And so we can get a little bit of success, feeling success, that we can actually do this a little bit. So that can help us to get into this practice. But all of these three, labeling and noting, anchoring in the breath, or generating thoughts, are not part of the standard practice, but they are short-term strategies you may find helpful initially to help us to get more into the practice. There's another common experience sometimes people have at the beginning is no thoughts. That normally they have a lot of thoughts, but they sit down and watch, and then suddenly there's no thoughts there. There can be a number of reasons for that. One of the most common reasons is we're simply too intense in our focus. As normal in daily life, our habit is when we focus on something, we tense. And here there can be this tendency that when we're going to watch our thoughts, that we tense, because if we don't tense, we don't focus tensely, we're just going to get swept away. So we tense. And so what we're doing is we're suffocating the mind. There's no space for any thoughts to come up. So if you notice that your mind is quite tense, then you need to relax. Another reason why there can be no thoughts is our mind is sinking into dullness. So if you notice your mind is sinking into dullness, then sharpen the focus, arouse your attention. And then another common experience is we sit down and we watch, and then we go, there's no thoughts there. What's going on? Normally I have lots of thoughts, but now my mind has gone completely still. I don't know what I'm doing. I think I must be doing it wrong because there's nothing there at all. So of course, that's all mental chit chat, all mental chit chat. So just watch that. Or you may be sitting there watching and getting very frustrated. So remember, frustration is a mental event. Boredom is a mental event. So whatever mental event is arising, observe that. And if there really is nothing there, then observe the empty space, because we want to maintain a continuity of attention. Because otherwise, if we don't pay attention onto that space, we may just sink into dullness and then we don't notice anything that comes up. So there are a few things to do when there's no thoughts. So that's a couple of tips for the practice. We have now time for question answer. So got any questions, Miffy?
Yeah, so I have one just also to give people a moment to type into the chat of
Sure.
when watching the thoughts, not, I didn't label them with words as such, but I had this sensation of going, oh yeah, there's one, oh yeah, there's one.
Mm-hmm.
And if I didn't kind of have that conceptually, then I just got lost in the story. So
Right.
what's going on?
Oh, that's fine. I mean, I mean, this is already insight, is that, you know, we never really look at our mind. We just go off, you know. And so the beginning stages of this practice, like the breath practice, is just simply noticing how chaotic our mind really is, how out of control the mind really is. So that's already progress. But so again, anything where we're doing a little bit of extra commentary can be helpful initially. But remember, it's only short-term strategy, because commentary is extra. So we're doing commentary on commentary on commentary. So, but any little bit of commentary initially, like, oh, there's one, oh, there's one, there's one. If that helps not getting swept away, that's good. And then eventually, when we get more into the habit of being able to observe, we won't need that commentary. We can let it go. So a little bit of commentary in the beginning can be helpful.
Okie dokie. And then Linda asks, should we be able to be aware of the difference between when we're using introspection and mindfulness?
Well, mindfulness is focusing on the object, to be focusing on the object. Introspection is monitoring the mindfulness. Introspection's job is to notice if we're getting dull or distracted. So mindfulness is like focusing on the object, and introspection is monitoring that mindfulness.
And we should be aware which one we're employing at any one time, or it just be automatic?
Well, yeah, I mean, initially we'll have to put effort, as we saw in the last program when we looked at the windy road and we had the big flame there at the bottom. We saw there that we need to put a lot of effort initially to mindfulness, and a lot of effort consciously to monitor. But as we move along there, it gets smaller and smaller. And so, as I mentioned just, I think, earlier in this session and also in the last program, is that if we simply are working on improving mindfulness, then our ability to introspect, to monitor, automatically improves. And then over that fault of over application is at a higher level when we're making unnecessary effort in terms of monitoring. Then that's a problem, because already at that level, our mindfulness and introspection are so well tuned that they're sort of running automatically without effort. And putting extra effort then is a fault. And we'll start to notice that actually a little bit earlier as well. Once we start to have a bit better mindfulness and introspection, you will notice that if you put too much effort in your mindfulness, or too much effort in your monitoring, that can create a little bit of tension.
Okay. And then when you're talking about mindfulness as being remembering the object, I'm just trying to fit that into, and you might have covered this in the last course, our kind of Western, the difference between, say, focusing and being mindful and attention deficit where our focus is captured. So is that the difference between attention capture and actually concentrating, that there is this intention to focus and remember the object?
I didn't quite catch your question again. I
So
think you
I'm
had
just
some
trying to
background.
figure out what the difference between, say, attention capture is and focus. So when, you know,
Attention capture. What do you mean by attention capture? You
oh,
mean you get caught up in something,
yeah,
or?
like being 100% focused on what's on telly.
Right. So that's, I mean, that's mindful. You're being completely fully present on that. But remember, here in Shamatha practice, we are focusing on a single object, whereas in certain situations in daily life, that may not be a good idea. You know, if there's danger around and we're sort of caught up in something, then that could be counterproductive. But here, certainly in shamatha practice, we want to give 100% attention to, in shamatha practice that is, we want to give 100% attention to the object.
Okay. And then a couple of people have asked, if we meditate without relaxation, is this how that Tibetan disease of lung builds up?
I know from my own experience and talking to many people, exactly, that this lung just means wind or energy, but often it's the salung, which is basically in Tibetan medicine, it's a term that's given to a lung, a wind imbalance, a subtle energy imbalance. And I think from the perspective of Tibetan medicine, most of us in the modern world have some degree of lung from our lifestyle, you know, that because we have a lot of tension and agitation in our life. So I think, in fact, I think we find that in Attention Revolution, a Tibetan doctor friend of Alan's basically mentioned to him that according to him, most people in the modern world are suffering lung at some level, but somehow manageable. But we can make that even more, we can really make that quite extreme here, in that if we, and we notice that from, even if we're not meditating, if we are, like if we're on some sort of project or some task and we're focusing with a lot of tension for hours on end, days on end, I mean, you notice some things, your mind gets very agitated and you get exhausted. And so similarly, if we're doing this sort of shamatha practice, and if we're only doing 15 or 20 minutes in the morning with tension, it's not really going to change much. But if we are doing a shamatha retreat where we're doing this sort of practice for many hours a day, days on end, weeks at a time, with a lot of tension, then we can really wind up the subtle energies in the body and really get completely out of sync. So yeah, that's what's called lung, and that comes from applying a lot of tension over a sustained period of time.
So, Glenn, we would be in quite a bit of danger of this because really, I mean, I spend a lot of time on a computer and I notice if I focus with a tense mind, I very quickly feel like my head's going to explode. So I've had to
Right.
relax. But I've
Yeah.
never meditated for that long, so I've never noticed, but I probably start off really bad habit.
Um, exactly. So many of us, that's why I've put so much emphasis on basis of relaxation, because that is most of us in the modern world, due to our lifestyle and so forth, and bombarded by stimulus. We are, as this Tibetan doctor friend of Alan said, we're all pretty well all suffering from lung at some level. And so really, to then, with that basis of already being quite unbalanced, to go into this sort of practice, and again, doing it for 15, 20 minutes a day is not really going to change anything. But if we're doing this practice for hours a day, days and weeks in a retreat setting with a lot of tension, then we're really going to unbalance even more. Whereas if we really emphasize relaxation, then in this practice, and we're doing relaxation for hours at a time, days at a time, that's going to flow into our daily life. We're going to start to notice that in our normal activities where we do apply a lot of tension and get agitated and exhausted, we'll notice, oh, Actually, I've done 3 hours of work on my computer and I feel pretty good now. Usually I'm very agitated and exhausted, but now I seem to be in a lot better situation. And that's because of the relaxation emphasis in shamatha practice.
Okay, so that's really good to hear, especially since kind of relaxing in our culture seems to be like you're having a bit of a bludge, but actually like it's a mental health thing, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, yeah.
So that's the end of the questions for tonight.
Sure. Okay. Good. We're just about running out of time, so let's leave it there. So let's finish off by dedicating the efforts we've put in this evening session. So I'd like to use for this program the dedication we used in the last program at the end, and we'll use this dedication in each evening session in this program. So let's dedicate all of the efforts we've gathered through our time together here this evening based on Shantideva's dedication prayers. So let's do that together now. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. So the next session is on Friday, so we'll continue this practice of observing thoughts, and in Friday's session we'll sort of do a variation of that where we're going to emphasize observing our emotions, which often sort of get missed in this practice, and we'll talk a little bit about also stages of progress in this shamatha practice, observing the mind. So that's also going to be one of the main topics in Friday's session. So until Friday then, stay safe, stay well, and we'll look forward to seeing you again on a Friday evening, same time. Bye now.